Hey, my name is Matt Storr and I repair saxophones for a living, and today I would like to talk to you about the Martin Handcraft Soprano saxophone. Now, the Martin Handcraft was a model of saxophone built by Martin, which is different from the guitar company, from about 1914 till about 1930. And as the name suggests, they were handcrafted instruments. They are, relative to most other makes of the same time period, relatively unknown and, in my opinion, quite undervalued. They possess some rather basic keywork, although not inelegant, and very robust. And they sport soft soldered tone holes, which can be troublesome because, especially after such a long time, this instrument is from 1927. A lot of times that soft solder has broken down, or if the body's been damaged, then the joint can be separated. And finding a leak in those tone holes is somewhat troublesome, and fixing them well, especially on an instrument like this one where it's plated, can be pretty difficult. Now luckily this one didn't have any solder leaks, so I didn't even have to deal with that, but that is something that you would often be dealing with on a handcraft built by Martin. The very first run of the handcrafts, which is one that I wouldn't recommend purchasing, has straight tone holes and isn't quite the same as the later ones where you've got these really thick beveled tone holes that most people associate with Martin. And the ones built from 1919 to 1929 have a front F, although they do not on soprano. And those are the ones that I would look for. And you can typically pick those up, in alto at least, for just a few $100. Tenor not too much more expensive. The sopranos, however, are fairly rare, and most people who have ever played one know that they are some of the best vintage sopranos ever made. And in my particular opinion, I think that the Martin Handcraft Soprano is the best vintage soprano. I think if I had to own one vintage soprano saxophone, I would own something very much like the one we're looking at here, with this beautiful gold plate and special engraving. If I could own two vintage sopranos, I would probably own one of these and then a Conn New Wonder Series 2. But the Martin Handcraft Soprano is a superb instrument that has excellent intonation for a vintage soprano. Totally serviceable keywork. The left-hand pinky table, although somewhat basic, is nice and snappy and easy to navigate. The palm keys are in a updated. When you think about like a Mark VI soprano, these palm keys look more modern than a Mark VI that was made. What would that be? 30 years later, 40 years later. So it's very serviceable as far as the keywork goes. And the tone on these things is just incredible. It's impossible to really communicate how wonderful the tone is on a Martin soprano saxophone, but it is warm, lush, and just beautiful. A lot of times, soprano sax, you wouldn't want to practice it or have it practiced in front of you in a small room. It's just the tone can be somewhat grating, even on the best. It's just something that you want to experience from a little farther away. But the Handcraft Soprano, the tone is just so beautiful and so flexible, and the intonation is particularly impressive, and seems to be amenable to a wider range of mouthpieces than most. Now, obviously, your experience may vary, and you've got to get it in good shape first, which can be fairly expensive depending on what's happened to the instrument. This instrument luckily didn't have any of the tone holes that were damaged, but sometimes on these you will find something called the never leak pad system, and this one had it at one point anyways, where there is a little dome soldered into the key cup, and then the pads are very thin and they're screwed in, and they kind of gimbal around on that dome to seal themselves rather than be floated in, and it was called the never leak pad system. And so what someone had done to this instrument was they hadn't removed these domes, and then they put thick pads in, which meant that the pads were super, super thick and were hitting in the back first when they hit the tone hole because they were way too thick. They didn't close all the way. And then someone bent everything around and actually broke several keys. And getting the geometry corrected after everything had been bent into a potato chip, and there was several keys broken up here. Hopefully you can't see it. You can probably see some evidence where I've got some new pearls up here, but lots of keys had snapped on this. So these horns can be kind of a can of worms. So be prepared for an expensive overhaul if you get one, but the results are worth it in my opinion. Now, as far as the actual construction of the instrument, you've got single post construction, but it's very robust, very thick posts, usually a very thick body on these, and it's kind of resistant to damage. On the altos and tenors, the bell-to-body brace is not a super great design, but in soprano you're not dealing with that too much, although you do have this thumb ring on the back, which is almost always ovaled out. The correct shape is round. That's what they are originally, but you'll see so many of them that have been ovaled out from cases, or sometimes people even do it on purpose because maybe they think it's more comfortable for their thumb. But the original shape of this is round. And the one thing that can be really difficult on sopranos is getting this keywork to feel snappy. And I mean, that can be true on sopranos in general, but vintage sopranos, I mean, if you look at these keys, you see that the rod that like the stack is on is really close to the body. These posts are pretty short, and the distance from the fulcrum to the key itself is not very far. So it's kind of like clapping like this versus like this. It's a lot easier to get a nicer, louder, like a better feel, a lot more force that way than it is with a much shorter throw. And that's kind of what it's like on these sopranos. So getting it to feel, and like let's do the pop test. Getting that sort of snappiness can be somewhat difficult. And a lot of times these vintage sopranos with these really low posts kind of suffer because of that, and people think they feel naturally terrible, but they don't. It just takes a bit more work to get them to feel the way they should. And you'll find some kind of odd stuff on old vintage sopranos, not Martin's in particular, but Martin's have it, lots of other sopranos do, where you've got this like bar key here for your C sharp that is activated, that has the piece of adjustment material back here behind the B, and that can be difficult to make that feel good. And the bis is attached to the bar instead of the A, so that when you press the A down to play C, the energy goes from the A pearl through the bis to this bar to close the C. So getting that to feel like it's all one monolithic piece and have it feel snappy can be difficult. Also on Martins, the later ones in particular, you'll find you've basically got a mechanism to bring down the pitch on the upper C sharp. It closes this key a little bit, and you can adjust how far you want that to go. Typically I find that it doesn't close all the way if you want it to, the high C sharp to be in tune. If you get it too close to the tone hole, then that C sharp will sound stuffy. If you close it all the way, usually that means it's flat, but for different people and different mouthpieces, etc., you might have different results there. It's also got the old school octave mechanism like you find on Kahn New Wonder Series 2s, and the way you get that set up is similar. Start off by doing your 2 octave keys and getting them seated, and then get your key here, these long arms, get them to close those keys at the same time. And then you install your G and seat the pad, and then you put a piece of adjustment material here so that it keeps this closed when the pad is shut. And then you put a piece of adjustment material here along with a piece of adjustment material at the bottom of the bis to make sure that when the G is open, this opens it all the way up to touch that, so you don't get double action. And I apologize for like the super fast run through. I actually have to give this back in like 10 minutes, and I wasn't really able to prepare as much as usual. I mean, I usually do these off the top of my head, but I usually have at least, time to do a redo, but this time I don't. So the things that you really want to look out for on these are the tone holes. Now, it's a little bit easier to see on a plated instrument. I mean, if the plating isn't broken here, then you probably have a pretty good idea that the solder behind it isn't broken. But on the lacquered instruments, the lacquer tends to wear here, and then it's difficult to tell whether you're just seeing a little bit of corrosion or whether you're actually seeing a leak in the tone hole. One of the things you can do to test a leak in the tone hole, I mean, you can look at it, you can put a leak light in, and you can press on the body tube if you think there's a leak somewhere, and you might actually move a little bit to show a little bit of light coming through. But you can take some denatured alcohol and just drop it on there, and it's very thin, and it'll wick in and show up on the inside of the tone hole if there's actually a leak. Sometimes you can reflow solder, so if you've got like a little bit of a leak here, you can reflow it in to fix that, but most of the time you're going to have to take the tone hole all the way off, clean off the old solder and put the tone hole back on. And obviously, if you have to do that several times, that can be pretty costly, just because it takes a while. And you can see, for instance, this post is really close to this tone hole here, right? And this tone hole is pretty robust. It's pretty thick. So the amount of heat I'd have to put into here to have this pop off might loosen this. Obviously, I can do things to try and make that not happen, but literally it's sharing a solder joint with that. So things like, and this one too, and that one too, right? So that sort of stuff can make this job difficult, particularly on the Sopranos where all this stuff is so close together. And also, you can do the most perfect pad job in the world. If you've got tone hole leaks, your horn is leaky. It's going to be the same effect. So that's something definitely to watch out for. Now this instrument is in gold plate, which is pretty rare for these, and it also has extra engraving, which is just beautiful. Isn't that gorgeous? Now as far as resonators and pads and stuff, typically I put flat metal resonators on these. There's not a whole lot of tone space, right, in the, between the key cups and the tone holes, just because, again, of having such a short throw, like this, you're mostly relying on the space in the front of the pad. So if this is the tone hole and this is the pad, you're relying a lot on having this space here, and you can only open it up so much before it feels really weird. When you've got a key that has a fulcrum that's farther away, you've got a little bit more tone space in the back, so even for the same opening, you've actually got more tone space. But when you've got something really close, you end up with less tone space for the same opening. So typically I don't like to put anything in these that impinges upon that tone space, like a domed resonator, although I see that installed a lot. But in my opinion, a flat metal resonator in these gives it, lots of tone space and therefore more projection. So a lot of times you might think that a domed resonator is going to be really what would liven a horn up, but sometimes in a case like this, it might actually deaden it because you're functionally reducing the tone hole openings. So, key fitting on these can be a real pain. I mean, you see that you've got these long stacks with lots of pieces that are going in different directions. The upper stack in particular is a real pain. You've even got your high E on it, and then your bis and the G that are coming in different places, and figuring out how exactly to swedge so that all this stuff acts together and is free and doesn't have any play in it can be pretty difficult. So doing the upper stack key fitting on an instrument like this, like a Conn New Wonder Series 2 or one of these, can be pretty time consuming. So it actually, even though the key work is simpler to look at as far as you've only got one long rod here, that's usually much more time consuming to get that key work perfect. And in this case, because of all the broken keys, it took me a long time. This is also a single long rod, believe it or not. And if this gets damaged at any point, then that can be kind of difficult to get this hinge tube to be straight and acting the correct way. And this one was actually pretty bent, but it's really light now. But that can be pretty time consuming. And I guess that's about it. This isn't quite up to par with my normal Repairman's overview, but then again, like I said, I actually have to go right now to go ahead and return the saxophone to its owner, who's very excited to get it back after it's been in the shop for a while for a major rebuild. And hopefully you can't tell that I had to do about 50 hours of work on this to get everything back to where it's operating the way it should. But man, these horns, the Martin Handcraft Sopranos, if you ever get to try one, give it a go. Assuming it's in proper operating condition, you're in for a real treat. Thanks for watching. My name is Matt Storr. I repair saxophones for a living. If you have any comments, questions, anything you'd like to say, feel free to ask below. Give me a call, send me an email. Check out the open source saxophone project. That is something I'm working on that most people don't seem to know about yet, but it's got lots of information about how to actually repair instruments, what goes into it, etc. These videos are a big part of it. But yeah, that's about it. Thanks for watching.